it's all wound up and they go in, and it seems so easy now compared to when these men were doing it by hand. But the results are pretty much the same. And you may or not see, this is a good example, you've got the slits in it. Again, that allows the water. And as I say, the water really is supposed to come up through the water table, and then it seeps into the cracks, and that's how the silt does not get down in. So with these, they will sometimes put socks on them. They're called like a sleeve over it to keep silt from percolating down through the top slits. But otherwise, packing the soil over the top of this kind of setup was generally enough to keep that water from draining silt down into there. And that's why putting stones over the top was not recommended, because they could fill up with silt. And there were many different types of tiles, and it just kind of depended on what you thought you needed. Some tiles actually fitted into one another, like an actual drain pipe, but then again, that was kind of not really good because you weren't trying to make a drain. You needed to have a space for the water to seep up into the tile to come out. We had a half moon tile. There was egg-shaped tiles, which I don't have, and of course the horseshoe tile. And really, at 7:30, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I did bring the book for reference. Sure.
The lengths of the tile, how long were they?
I see varying lengths. A lot of them were like 14 inches, and it just depended. But usually about 14 inches, 17 inches sometimes.
It's small.
Yeah, and maybe that originated from when, it's probably the practice the way the extruder was cutting. The original ones were short because they were shin bone tiles. And I'm not really sure historically why, if they just kept that length because it was handy or not.
If you get too long, it would crack under stress.
It's true. Yeah.
Do you know where the pottery firm was that Johnston first worked with?
I do not know the location of Mortonby's, no.
It's in Waterloo.
It's in Waterloo, but I don't know.
It's along the canal somewhere.
Yeah, it was behind, the canal was behind it.
On the south side of the river.
But I don't know what road it was off of, like how you could get to it.
What determined the depth?
That's a good question. Sometimes it just depended on how hard it was to get down working the soil, or how, Johnson had a way he would say, figure out where your water table was, and you want it just above your water table, which I guess could change over time, but he would have you put like sort of dig a hole, and you would monitor how the water came up, I don't know, over like a certain period of time, like 48 hours, and you would see how full it was. But it definitely depended on the soil, because some people would put the drains down. I think Johnston, his writings say, about 4 feet down, 4.5 feet. And then there's some people that only did it 2.5 feet, and some that did it maybe even a little lower. So.
I know on the tour of Rose Hill, there's in Robert Swan's study, there's a map, and it shows where all the tile was put.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's not even, I can't even comprehend how much tile they put in at Rose Hill. And it was all Irish immigrants mostly that did that work.
Right, yeah. And I'm thinking, so Johnston ended up having a little over 300 acres before he kind of retired and sold things off. But he had over 74, I think I did write it down here, he had like 74 miles in tile, I think. Which when you think about miles of tile, all hand dug. And when I worked at Rose Hill, I used to know how much Robert Swan had, but I couldn't find it in the book. But I know he had over 91,000 foot of tile laid in 100 days. That's a lot of tile.
I have it on my papers at home,
Yeah.
but I don't remember exactly.
But like you said, the tile maps, and of course the tile map was a very important thing to have, obviously. And again, depending on the soil and how much they thought you needed to drain, there's a lot to it that was written about in the earlier history. What people are doing now, the science of it, I admit, I didn't really give much research on that. But some of these drain tiles, would be, I don't know, 27 feet apart, and sometimes even closer. So it really depended on the farm.
They do have a great collection of the drain tiles at the Johnston.
Yes.
Well, the building behind the Johnston house.
Yes, they used to be on display. And
well, I think they are on display, and they built a special little building there for them. But I think that Mike Weaver picked up, the story that I heard is that he worked for some agricultural, I don't know, USDA or something. And so he was out on a lot of farms and
Right.
he was seeing these drain tiles, so he just started, you know, picking them up and bringing them home, had them in his garage. I remember going, after he passed away, going to the auction at his place, but I think at that time, they had given a lot of these tiles to the Geneva
Right.
Historical Society,
Right.
who probably thought, what the heck are we gonna do with all of these?
No, actually, no, not really, because I worked at Rose Hill when I was a lot younger. And one of the reasons that Mike Weaver wrote this book was the same reason that Miles Manley wrote it. They really wanted this information not to be lost. And Merrill, of course, knew Merrill Ronke, who did Rose Hill. He knew Mike Weaver very well. And no, it was talked about bringing them, giving them to us.
Yeah,
He eventually decided to give them to us at Rose Hill. Yeah.
I helped move those tiles and I helped set up the first exhibit in the Johnson House.
Yeah, I mean, we were excited to get them. It wasn't like the Historical Society was
Oh,
like, what is this?
no.
No, because that was all part of the plan. And it was interesting, you know, fixing that house up. Just to think that, you know, very humble spot, and this man really, it really was to revolutionize agriculture. Later on, let's see, why can't I think of his name? He's got a very long name. His last name is Bailey, Cornell.
Liberty.
Liberty Hyde, yeah, such a strange name. Liberty Hyde Bailey, you know, he says, there's this quote that I read that he's like, you know, the Rose Hill and the Johnston Farm are the two most important spots in American agriculture, basically. And then, of course, that memorial was dedicated in 1935, and that was interesting because the station didn't want to take care of it. We were going to take care of it, but then who was going to be the custodian of the memorial? And that became a big thing. But eventually, the station was supposed to be the custodian of the memorial. Any more questions?
We have a problem in our backyard. It's either the water table's too high or there's a natural spring there. But in the one general area, it's always wet. So we came just to drain that off. So would that just be a simple drain system, or how would you tackle a situation like that?
Well, they did use drain tile to help reroute springs.
Okay, so if there's a spring there,
Yeah, I mean, if it is a spring, you're not butted up against, you're not near agricultural land where there's a broken tile.
right?
You know, that could even be the case of what you're dealing with there too.
There's always surface water there, so I'm wondering if it's a high water table or a natural spring. You know?
Yeah, it could be either.
Yeah, you could dig a test hole and see what it does.
Yeah.
Fills up.
Didn't you want a pond?
Hmm?
You want a pond, don't you?
I do.
Everybody wants a pond, right? Yeah.
Our neighbor's done a lot of the plastic drain tile, and Kevin Swartley's the operator, comes in, and he's got at one spot he sets his plow down, and it sets his GPS. And then he can go down to the field, and he knows exactly where the tiles he put in before were, in case one gets plugged or broken, he knows right where it is. And then he uses a laser level to set the grade. Years ago, he used to have soil and water come in, and they would shoot grades, put stakes in, and the big Cleveland wheel trencher had an arm onto it to control how deep you went, so you had a constant grade. You didn't have any low spots or high spots.
Variations.
But they can put in a lot faster when they plow it. There's less dirt to put back, so.
People are always asking us at Rose Hill, are there still tiles in the ground here? And I'm like,
Of course there are.
probably there are. I mean, who would have dug them up, you know?
No, they're there. And for the most part, a lot of those old tiles are still doing their job, especially the ones that were laid properly. But it's true, the grade is the most important thing, because if you sway off that grade, that's where you're gonna get the washouts and the tiles aren't gonna work. They had all kinds of contraptions to help measure that, keep it level, which is a whole other chapter. Yeah.
A question for you. We've got a roughly 10-acre hayfield. Didn't know historically that it had any drain tile in it. There was always one low spot. The low spot, of course, springtime would turn into a little lake. And over the course of weeks, you know, as the season would dry out, it would disappear. about 2 years ago, in the center of that low spot, began to get much lower than the rest of the area. And was it last year? When we finally went out there and walking around and fell into a crevice and discovered a piece of the 5-inch clay tile. And got a shovel and dug around and, sure enough, there's tile that was
How
probably
deep?
2.5 feet.
2.5 feet deep.
But what made that particular area fail like that? Any idea? We've
Well,
never seen any outlets, where the tile would have exited to like the ditch along the edge of the road.
well, of course, maybe not, maybe that tile's destroyed and it's
sinkhole?
plugged, but it could have been, usually when they break, it's something upstream, usually there's a plug upstream somewhere. But there again, without a tile map, you'd have to kind of dig, and, tiles, you would also have larger main tiles that would be, a little bit lower, so the other side tiles would feed into them, so, I don't know which yours was, I mean, it may have been a side one, it may have been a deeper one, but that's where the tile map comes in, and, I wouldn't really know what some of these farmers would have done with the old tile maps. I don't even know if they'd be
Get
kept
lost.
with deeds, that's what I would think, is they'd get lost, so. So the only thing you could do is just do a lot of digging.
How would you date the 5-inch clay tile that's up there?
50s, 40s?
I'm gonna, no, I wouldn't even begin to date these, I would have to I just have a pretty decent idea of the history of how they came into being and how they kind of spread, and appreciate what they've done for our agriculture, but I really don't know how to date all of them. I mean, if you get the book there as well, I mean, you can flip through this book. I mean, I haven't looked at every single aspect of it, but it may actually give you an idea of when some of the tiles were made.
Held up really, really well. I mean, the piece we dug out looked like, other than some soil staining on it,
I
it
mean,
looked like brand new.
Most of these were made, here,
Right.
obviously, right in our area, Seneca County, down in Waterloo. There were a few tile factories in Canandaigua, and again, tiles were not made in this country until like 1848. I mean, other than the handmade tiles at Wardby's, with that machine that the two gentlemen were using, but really, so everything's kind of 1860s, when did they start switching over to these synthetic tiles? Again, that's a weakness. Probably, obviously, after the 70s, we didn't have as much plastics. That's when plastics took off. So I feel like these might be more like 80s, 90s time when we started using these kind of tiles for drainage. But I wouldn't say that I knew exactly.
I also heard that the tile machine, like one of those old tile machines, still exists somewhere, like maybe in the Waterloo Museum or something.
It may very well.
Yeah, but
Again,
they
that
have-
didn't. Yeah.
I don't know where.
Definitely a topic for further discussion, more about the actual, how they're made. I do know that in the Mike Weaver collection, there is a tile with a swastika in it, because there was German POWs working at the tile making factory in the 1940s. So that one's kind of an interesting artifact that you can see at the Draintown Museum. But really, they used to clay tiles for quite some time, probably right up into the 50s and 60s. I can't imagine they did plastics before then, because as I said, they didn't have the plastic boom until the 70s.
I read that, there were a lot of nurseries in the Geneva area in the 19th century and early 20th century. But when some of those went out of business and they started putting in basically subdivisions within the city area, that they ran into a lot of the tile that had been laid there, which caused a lot of drainage issues for some of the houses.
I can believe that, because some of the excerpts I was reading when I was trying to get more information for the talk, Maxwell, who was a nurseryman, really put stock in the tile and laid it on all his land. Yeah. So, and he was a nurseryman in Geneva. But it's everywhere underneath the soil, you wouldn't know it's there, doing its job.
Any more questions?
Good.
Thank you, Pam.
You're
Very
welcome.
educational. She's got her Cornell to be the speaker at Plow Days. There's information up here on it. She's going to be talking about her work at the Cornell Research Farm, right, on grapes.
I can talk about grapes. I can also talk about the conception of the station,
Oh,
the
okay.
history of the station, yeah.
So, and we also have our newest edition of the newsletter there. Thank you for coming. There's refreshments up here. Thank you for making